It was a typical Monday morning at Argent Corp headquarters, and the executive floor buzzed with the clipped sounds of polished shoes, hurried greetings, and the clatter of espresso cups. The CEO, Alexander Grant, was in one of his showy moods, the kind where his arrogance floated ahead of him like expensive cologne. He enjoyed power not just in the boardroom, but in the subtle domination of everyday moments. Today, his audience was larger than usual, several department heads, 2 junior executives eagerly trying to impress him, and a cluster of interns trailing behind like nervous shadows. While the staff gathered in the corridor outside the conference room, Maria, the cleaning lady, silently wiped down the glass doors nearby. She wore a faded uniform, her hair tucked into a simple bun, and her eyes fixed on the task in front of her. She was used to being invisible, a part of the background people rarely noticed unless there was a spill or a mess. Alexander, flipping through a portfolio of multilingual documents prepared for an upcoming international deal, suddenly smirked when his gaze drifted toward Maria. One of the interns, trying to impress him, made an offhand comment about how only the top-tier staff could understand the documents. That was all it took for the CEO's ego to flare. With his voice raised just enough for bystanders to hear, Alexander waved a printed sheet covered in intricate foreign text, something in Japanese or Turkish, no one was sure. "I'll tell you what," he said loudly, eyes glittering with condescension, "I'll give my entire monthly salary to anyone here who can translate this right now." He made a show of scanning the group, but instead of landing on an executive or intern, he pointed straight at Maria. "You there, how about you? Think you can translate this?" His tone dripped with false politeness, each word carefully measured to provoke laughter without sounding explicitly cruel. A few people exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh or cringe. One junior exec chuckled nervously, while another whispered, "She probably doesn't even know what language that is." The interns watched with wide eyes, unsure whether this was a test or a performance. Alexander leaned back against the glass wall, arms crossed, confident the cleaning lady would refuse, panic, or walk away. In his mind, this wasn't just a joke, it was a demonstration of superiority, a reminder of hierarchy. The statement about his salary wasn't meant to be taken seriously, it was a mockery dressed as a challenge. The bystanders expected embarrassment. What they didn't expect was silence, not from her, but from him, once the moment took a very different turn. Maria had learned long ago that silence could be a shield. People looked at her uniform and assumed they already knew her story, uneducated, desperate, replaceable. What they didn't see was the life she'd lived before the janitor's cart, the books she'd read, the languages she'd spoken, and the battles she'd quietly survived. 10 years earlier, Maria had been a university lecturer in her home country. She specialized in linguistics and translation, fluent in 5 languages and conversational in 2 more. She taught phonetics, syntax, and comparative linguistics to students who once called her Professor Navarro. Her future had seemed secure, until political upheaval and an economic collapse swept everything away. With her university shut down and her savings gone, she was forced to immigrate with her son, taking whatever work she could find to survive. That meant cleaning offices at night and early mornings while her son studied. She hid her qualifications because employers, she'd learned, didn't always value them if there was no local paperwork to back them. So she folded her past into silence and let people assume what they wanted. Still, she hadn't let her knowledge fade. She read novels in different languages during her breaks. She listened to podcasts in French and Japanese while sweeping empty boardrooms. Sometimes, she paused outside conference rooms and listened to executives mispronounce words from foreign clients, quietly correcting them in her mind. She knew more about the companies she cleaned for than half the managers did, simply by paying attention to discarded documents and conversations nobody thought she understood. Her coworkers occasionally teased her for being too serious or too quiet, not knowing she was translating poetry in her head while wiping fingerprints off glass tables. She once helped another cleaner write an email in English to resolve an issue with her landlord. She never mentioned she could have written it in Spanish, Italian, or Arabic too. So when Alexander, in his arrogance, waved that sheet of foreign text at her, Maria didn't flinch. She didn't react with shock or fear. In fact, she recognized the script at a glance, kanji and hiragana, mixed with romanized annotations. Japanese. A business agreement draft about distribution rights and partner obligations. She'd translated more complex documents in her 20s for international conferences. But no one around her knew that. To them, she was just the cleaning lady, a background figure with a mop and a quiet demeanor. They didn't know she had once spoken at symposiums. They didn't know she translated academic papers and diplomatic correspondence. They didn't know she could dissect that document with ease. Alexander thought he'd chosen the perfect target for humiliation. He had no idea he'd just challenged the one person in the room most qualified to respond. The hallway had gone still, as if the moment were holding its breath. Maria didn't reach for the paper immediately. Instead, she calmly set her rag on the cleaning cart and wiped her hands, not in hesitation but in quiet preparation. She stepped toward Alexander, whose smirk widened with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already written. He held the document out with 2 fingers, as though offering a prop in a performance. The interns watched eagerly. A manager nearby folded her arms, expecting an awkward refusal. One of the receptionists mouthed, "This is so unnecessary," but didn't speak aloud. Maria took the paper gently, glanced over the lines, and her eyes moved quickly but with intent. No panic. No stumbling. Just the steady rhythm of familiarity. The room's anticipation shifted. Some of the onlookers exchanged puzzled looks. Why wasn't she flustered? Alexander, noticing the lack of reaction, chuckled. "You don't have to pretend to understand it," he said. "Just give it your best shot. Maybe you'll guess a word or 2. Maria looked up at him, not with defiance, but with the kind of calm that unsettles arrogance. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft but clear, and she began to translate the text aloud, line by precise line. The document outlined terms of an exclusive distribution agreement between Argent Corp and a Japanese partner regarding manufacturing rights, import conditions, and confidentiality clauses. She didn't summarize. She didn't guess. She translated fluently, using correct business terminology and even clarifying implicit cultural nuances in the phrasing. Silence fell over the corridor like a dropped curtain. The intern's jaws slackened. One executive slowly lowered his coffee cup. The manager who'd been skeptical uncrossed her arms. Maria paused once to clarify a misplaced particle in the original sentence and offered a more contextually accurate rendering. She pronounced Japanese terms with natural cadence, switching fluidly between languages and English interpretation. When she finished the last line, she folded the paper and held it out, not with sarcasm, but with quiet dignity. "There is a minor mistranslation in the 3rd paragraph," she said evenly. "The clause implies an obligation where it should indicate mutual consent. You may want your legal team to revise that." Alexander's face had drained of amusement. His trademark smirk had vanished so completely it was as if it had never existed. The group behind him stood frozen, stunned into awkward stillness. For the first time since his mockery began, he had no quick words to throw. The challenge he'd made in jest had just transformed into a moment he could neither control nor undo. Maria didn't gloat. She simply returned to her cart, leaving behind a silence louder than any applause. In the seconds after Maria finished translating, the silence didn't just hang, it sharpened. The smug amusement that had animated Alexander's face dissolved into a mix of disbelief and discomfort. He glanced around, hoping to find even one ally still amused, but every pair of eyes around him had shifted. Some were stunned, others embarrassed on his behalf. A few looked quietly thrilled to see his arrogance punctured in public. One of the interns, the same one who had laughed earlier, tried to pretend he hadn't. He stood rigid, his expression neutral and his hands suddenly very interested in the seams of his pockets. The manager who'd been skeptical a moment ago now stared at Maria with the dawning recognition that this was not a coincidence or a lucky guess, this was competence, and extraordinary competence at that. Alexander, realizing his pedestal had tilted, attempted a weak laugh. "Well, that was unexpected," he muttered, but the confidence behind his words had collapsed. He had issued his challenge with an audience, and now that audience remembered every word, including the part where he declared he'd give his entire salary to anyone who could translate the document. Someone from the marketing team, half amused and half serious, spoke up from the back, "You did say your salary was on the table, sir." A few heads turned sharply, and someone actually coughed to hide a laugh. The statement wasn't confrontational, but it reminded everyone that his words hadn't been hypothetical. Suddenly, hierarchy didn't feel as fixed. Maria, who just minutes ago had been treated as scenery, now stood in the center of the room's attention without trying. She wasn't basking in it, she had already started to step away, but the shift was undeniable. Respect, the kind that could not be demanded by title or paycheck, had moved toward her like iron filings to a magnet. Alexander tried to recover control. "Let's not be dramatic," he said tightly, addressing no one in particular. It was clearly a joke. But that only made things worse. Several people exchanged looks that said, "It wasn't a joke when you issued it. It's only a joke now that you lost." For once, he sensed that pushing further might damage his image more than staying quiet. His authority, usually unquestioned, now felt fragile under the weight of his own words. And more than one witness suspected he would never have honored such a bet had he won, but now his refusal to acknowledge it only amplified his pettiness. Maria didn't ask for anything. She didn't argue or remind him of what he promised. That restraint only deepened the impact. Without trying, she had flipped the dynamic entirely. The CEO looked small, and the cleaning lady looked formidable. And that was the moment respect changed direction, quietly, but permanently. In the days that followed, the incident traveled through the company faster than an official memo ever could. What began as a humiliating spectacle meant to belittle a cleaning lady had become the quiet legend of Argentcorp. People spoke of it in elevators, whispered it over lunch breaks, and retold it with growing admiration for Maria and growing disbelief at the CEO's arrogance. Maria herself didn't speak about it. She continued her work the same way she always had, early mornings, quiet stride, meticulous attention to detail. But the way people looked at her shifted. The same employees who once walked past her without a glance now greeted her with warmth and respect. Some asked how many languages she knew. Others simply said, "Good morning," with a tone that implied apology for their past indifference. The HR director, a sharp woman named Evelyn Carter, heard the full story from multiple witnesses. Instead of brushing it off, she pulled Maria aside one afternoon in the staff lounge. "I'd like to understand your background," she said, not as an interrogation, but as an invitation. Within 10 minutes of conversation, Evelyn realized the company had unknowingly been overlooking a multilingual, academically trained professional with a resume that outshone half the senior staff. Evelyn requested Maria's permission to submit her profile to the talent acquisition board. At first, Maria hesitated. She'd grown accustomed to being dismissed, and part of her feared it was just another polite gesture that would lead nowhere. But Evelyn wasn't offering charity. She saw value. Meanwhile, Alexander faced a different kind of scrutiny. He couldn't escape the sideways glances, the muted smirks, or the awkward silence that followed when conversations shifted in his direction. During a board meeting, one of his fellow executives jokingly asked if his new compensation plan accounted for translation bonuses. He did not laugh. A week later, Maria was invited to interview, not for a cleaning supervisor role, but for a junior position in the company's international communications team. She took the test they offered and finished it in half the allotted time, flawlessly translating segments from Japanese, Spanish, and French. The hiring committee didn't just approve her, they were impressed. Within a month, she transitioned from night shifts and mop buckets to an office desk and a staff ID bearing a new title, Language and Cultural Liaison. Her salary multiplied. She no longer had to choose between paying rent and buying books for her son. As for the CEO's salary bet, she never brought it up. She didn't want his money, she had earned something more valuable, dignity acknowledged, limits broken, status rewritten. And without ever demanding it, she taught the entire company a lesson the CEO could never deliver in a boardroom: respect is not a title, it's a truth that reveals itself when arrogance is stripped away.